I don't know if this is on or not, but my name is Tom Hashey, and as Executive Director of the Center for Irish Programs, I want to extend a warm welcome to Boston College. In what will be, I promise, no more than a 1-minute infomercial, I would like to point out that we're all seated this evening in the Burns Library's British Catholic Authors Room, located one floor above the Irish Room. For decades, this facility has been a cultural icon for people engaged in scholarship relating to either British or the Irish cultural heritage. It's therefore abundantly appropriate, I believe, that the venue for this launch should be here for what is very arguably a book of notably authoritative and remarkably insightful essays about the manner in which these two cultures remain entwined even to this day. Moreover, contributing authors like Garrett Fitzgerald in the first volume, John A. Murphy, Mary Ann Elliott, Ed Maloney, Ray O'Hanlon, Kevin Cullen, and Ruth Dudley Edwards are old friends to many of us here at Boston College. In addition to the unrivaled Anglo-Irish book and manuscript holdings here in the Burns, we also have a world-class Irish studies faculty who have extensive ties with scholars throughout Ireland and Great Britain. And relatedly, our internationally renowned Irish Institute has, for over a decade, actively engaged with all of the political parties in Northern Ireland in a United States Congress-sponsored program promoting the peace process. Hence, when the director of the center, of our center in Dublin, telephoned to say that the British Council director in Ireland had asked if Boston College might be the venue or provide the venue for the program tonight, which incidentally has been orchestrated by the British and Irish Consulate Generals respectively, it was a no-brainer to accept. And surely it seems equally appropriate that this center's Dublin director, Mike Cronin, a British citizen of Irish ancestry who heads the Dublin office of an American university, should serve as chairperson for tonight's panel. I should now like to introduce the director of the British Council of Ireland, Tony Riley, and to ask you to join me in a round of applause welcoming him and all of our panelists.
Thank you very much, Tom. BC normally stands for British Council in my life, so I feel particularly comfortable launching this book here. I'm delighted to be here today at the first US launch of our second collection of essays on contemporary British-Irish relations entitled Britain and Ireland, Lives Entwined. The book we're launching here this evening is another significant milestone in the cultural relations work of the British Council, both on the island of Ireland itself and between the islands of Britain and Ireland. Exploring the complex web of relations that exist between Britain and Ireland, the book follows last year's successful volume of the same name, which followed a report published in 2004 called Through Irish Eyes, exploring attitudes towards the UK amongst young Irish people, commissioned by the British Embassy during John Rankin's time and the British Council. It was an extensive piece of qualitative and quantitative research, and a couple of very brief headlines from that the Through Irish Eyes survey might give you a flavour of it. Respondents were asked, for example, to consider for the moment their feelings about Britain and its people. 88% said they were either very well disposed or fairly well disposed, and only 9% claimed to be not very well disposed. Asked if they felt the relationship had improved between the two countries over the last 10 years, 87% said they felt it had. Asked about the relationship between the two governments, the majority described it as either good, very good, or excellent. Evidence from the quantitative data therefore suggested that there was a shift, a change in the tectonic plates of the archipelago that we call Britain and Ireland. However, lest we get too carried away with what Edna Longley, a contributor to the first Lives Entwined book, has described as the new romance between the old lion and the young tiger, the qualitative data was somewhat more nuanced, concluding that many aspects of the British-Irish relationship are highly paradoxical. The shared history and culture between our countries engenders a strong sense of familiarity and goodwill towards the UK amongst some, while also accounting for less favourable attitudes amongst others. It may best be summed up as a curious mixture of old animosity and real closeness of culture and experience. One of the participants in the focus groups during the Through Irish Eyes survey said, "We're a lot closer than we think." The complexities and nuances revealed in the Through Irish Eyes survey warranted further examination and investigation. Hence our decision to commission the essays contained in Britain and Ireland Lives Entwined 1 and the second book that we're launching here this evening. The title of the book was the title chosen by Pearse McHenry, a former Irish diplomat, who concluded at the end of his essay, having set out his own staunchly Republican formative years, he concluded that perhaps at the end of the day, there's a bit of the British in the Irish and Irish in the British. And certainly that possibility lies at the heart of both volumes. In prefaces to the first volume of essays, British Prime Minister Tony Blair and Taoiseach Bertie Ahern spoke of the close intertwining of our histories and peoples, and the fact that between near neighbours, relationships may never be entirely free from tensions. However, they both remarked on the recent process of what Dr. Garrett Fitzgerald, in his essay for the first volume, has referred to as the normalisation of relations between our two countries, of a growing maturity and a willingness to deal more comfortably with our shared, but often in the past divisive, historical heritage. Prime Minister Blair congratulated the way the essays in the first volume had treated the unique dynamics of the relationship between Britain and Ireland without ignoring or shying away from the knotty complexities and intricacies of it all, including, of course, the legacy of Northern Ireland. And it will be interesting to hear from the former Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Paul Murphy, on this in a moment. In this second book, we asked President McAleese to provide a preface, and her opening sentence goes as follows: "The spirit of real friendship and partnership that characterises the relationship between our two countries is an inspiring example of what can be salvaged from the ashes of historical enmity and inequality." In Lives Entwined 2, and of course part of the reason why we've crossed the Atlantic to launch and discuss the follow-up publication, we have fresh views on the nuanced and knotty complexities of British-Irish relations from this side of the Atlantic. We wanted to explore the triangular relationships between Britain, Ireland, and the US. In my introduction to the first book, I noted contributors remarking on the positive impact of Britain and Ireland now working against the larger backdrop of Europe. However, none of the essays in the first volume had really touched on the other major relationship that places both Britain and Ireland bracingly against a larger canvas, namely the relationships of Britain and Ireland with the USA. And so we decided in this second book to introduce a transatlantic perspective on Anglo-Irish relations. The US influence, both directly and indirectly, on British-Irish relations has undoubtedly been profound, enduring, and significant. From Martin Luther King, whose picture still adorns John Hume's office in Derry, and John was with us at the launch of this book last Wednesday in Dublin, through the Kennedy family, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, George Bush, Mitchell Reese, and that chair of all chairs, Senator George Mitchell, singled out for special and deserved praise in Liz O'Donnell's reflective contribution to this second book. All have played and continue to play a crucial role in Anglo-Irish relations. And we wanted to examine this more closely, to understand it better, and to explore what Kevin Cullen, your own home contributor, has called the American connection. In last Saturday's Irish Times, Foreign Affairs correspondent Declan de Braden noted that Bill Clinton will be back in Britain and Ireland and back in the news next week, addressing the British Labour Party conference in Manchester on one day, and then hosting and speaking at a high-powered charity dinner in Dublin on another. And perhaps Ray O'Hanlon, who will be with us at the launch tomorrow night in New York's observation in his essay that Britain and Ireland, he says, together gave birth to Irish America in all its hues, best captures what we hoped to explore and examine through the addition of an intriguing and crucially important US dimension to British-Irish relations. Without appearing immodest or preempting your own reactions to these books, and we would like to hear your views once you've had a chance to read them, having taken them away this evening, one of the strengths of both volumes lies in the willingness of an extraordinarily diverse collection of contributors to offer up a rich and rather unusual mix of personal anecdote and reflective analysis. Garrett Fitzgerald, for example, tells us of his County Antrim Ulster Presbyterian relatives on his mother's side, and how this, combined with his father's Southern nationalist family, gave him a very pluralist and eclectic upbringing on the island of Ireland. John Bruton, Ambassador Bruton, who will be with us tomorrow evening in New York, describes the impact on his County Meath farming family of the 1930s closure of the British market to Irish exports. He also shares memories of his first visit to Britain with his mother, travelling on the mail boat from Dunleary to Holyhead to visit an aunt. And Liz O'Donnell offers us some very frank reflections from a practising politician on her role on behalf of the Irish government in the George Mitchell-chaired Good Friday Agreement talks, a period she quite openly admits to being, quote, the most awesome period of her political career. And if you want to hear Kevin Cullen's anecdotes about watching football with the DUP in an Irish bar in Boston, or a piece of advice he offered a young Irish American troubled by her conscience, having accepted an invitation to attend a reception at the residence of John Rankin, the British Consul General, you won't have to wait for long, because Kevin will be telling such stories in a moment. The Lives Entwined project doesn't set out to tie up loose ends. There's nothing neat and tidy about history. The essays deliberately pose more questions than they answer. More dilemmas are presented than resolved, more contradictions and ambiguities exposed than arguments won. The only clarity afforded through the various expositions by contributors to both volumes is how uniquely complex the canvas of British-Irish, and we ought to add, US cultural relations really is. Why have the British Council done this? Intercultural dialogue lies at the heart of the British Council's work. We hope that this body of work and the dialogue, conversations, and perhaps controversies, and I'm not looking at Ed Maloney when I say that we know this book will stimulate, will help us take another small step towards clearer, deeper, and more lasting mutual understanding. And I'd like to hand over now to our chair, Mike Cronin, Director of Boston College's Dublin campus, as Tom Hashey explained, and our very distinguished panel to continue the dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony. It's actually very nice for me to be here, as it were, at the mothership, actually on campus doing something rather than doing things for BC over in Dublin. So thank you very much. It's funny, Tony and I were talking earlier about the last time we actually did some work together, which was during another British Council project on sporting relationships between Britain and Ireland. And we were invited on a sort of talk radio show in Dublin to discuss the project and the discussions that were going on. And what was interesting was the amount of abuse that came through on the email system into the studio, because the Irish listeners couldn't understand why there were two English guys talking about Irish sport. And I think it's interesting. I find it personally, I've been kind of working back and forth in Ireland for 15 years and been living there for the last couple of years. It's quite interesting the way things have changed. I think 15 years ago there was actually very few English voices beyond tourist 10-night stag nights in Ireland. And what's very noticeable now when you walk around, especially the city of Dublin, is the sheer number of British English people who are moving and living in Ireland. I think the dynamic's changing quite considerably. Not changing enough, though. I've been attending Croke Park for 15 years watching hurling and football. And when I went to the hurling final the other week, the Irish guy next to me said to me, having heard my accent, "Do you actually understand what's going on?" Anyway, moving on, because we are obviously here to talk about things like that. The whole mix of identities inherent within Britain, within Ireland, and now across the Atlantic, and certainly the Lives Entwined series. So it's a great pleasure to introduce the first speaker. I'm actually going to go down the whole line, and then we'll come back to the first speaker themselves. First of all, it'll be Garrett Fitzgerald, two times Taoiseach in the 1980s, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Chancellor of National University of Ireland, instigator of the New Ireland Forum, and now celebrating and recently celebrated by RTE in 3 documentaries his 80th birthday. So congratulations. Paul Murphy, Labour MP, Secretary of State for Northern Ireland 2002-2005, and previous to that Secretary of State for Wales, and again a key figure as Minister of State at the Northern Ireland Office for his role in the Good Friday Agreement. Liz O'Donnell, who recently, a couple of weeks ago, became Deputy Leader of the Progressive Democrats, TD for Dublin South since 1992, and as Tony touched on again, somebody who was very involved for the Irish government in the talks that led to the Good Friday Agreement. And the homeboy, as it were, the hometown boy, is Kevin Cullen, who's been a reporter of the Boston Globe for over 15 years. And among his other remits has emerged as one of the sort of most thoughtful American commentators and writers on the Northern Ireland situation. And from Dublin and Belfast did cover in some depth, again, the whole lead up to the Good Friday Agreement. And I suppose completing the whole circle of different places and identities, has also lived and worked in London as well. So, with great pleasure, I introduce Gareth Fitzgerald. You can...
So, go from here? Well,
Yep.
Much easier, yeah. I think this is the most important book. The core of it lies in the 4 pieces that address directly aspects of the Irish-British relationship, Marianne Elliott's historical reflections on that relationship, and the analysis by John A. Murphy, Ivana Batzig, and Ruth Dudley Edwards on how this relationship has developed in more recent times. But these 4 pieces are set within a context described here by 2 people who've directly participated in the political negotiations that have transformed the long drawn-out, have been transformed by the long drawn-out Northern Ireland peace process. That's John Bruton and Liz. The complexity of the situation within Northern Ireland that has had to be addressed is witnessed by Bernadette Makaliski's vivid account of her experiences, and by a passionate defense of the principle of publish and be damned by that most authoritative and informed journalist writing in Northern Ireland, Ed Maloney, with some parts of whose contribution I don't entirely agree. But there you are. And the U.S. sometimes key role and relationship with these matters is analysed by Kevin Cullen and Ray O'Hanlon. Ruth Dudley Edwards, for her part, identified some of the paradoxes of the English-Irish relationship. She quotes Macaulay on the Irish, who he described as being distinguished by qualities which tend to make men, he didn't mention women, interesting rather than prosperous. Alone among the nations of Northern Europe, he went on to say, they had the susceptibility, the vivacity, the natural turn for acting and rhetoric, which are indigenous to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. He also quotes Wilde, if only one could teach the English how to talk and the Irish how to listen, society here would be quite civilized. Which reminds me of what my father, our first Minister for External, was, as it was then, Foreign Affairs, once said to me, and he negotiated with the British throughout the whole of the 1920s. He said, the English say so little that the Irish cannot make out what they're thinking or what they mean, whereas the Irish say so much the British don't know what to believe. The story that emerges from this book is a fascinating one. Quite remarkable normalization within 2 decades of a relationship between 2 islands, 2 peoples, and latterly 2 governments, which for 8 centuries had been confrontational and often bitter. What has brought about so suddenly this dramatic change? Not merely at the intergovernmental level, but as Tony has said, at the popular level also. The immediate cause, as John A. Murphy rightly points out, has, most paradoxically, been the Northern Ireland conflict, a conflict which at times in the 1970s, in particular, in that bad decade, was responsible for quite bitter words and at times unhelpful actions emanating from both sides of the Irish Sea. On the Irish side, by 1972, there had emerged a recognition amongst the political class, or most of them, that the interest of the Irish state, threatened as it was by IRA violence and by the capacity of Sinn Féin to arouse dangerous emotions, required the restoration of peace and stability in a Northern Ireland that would remain in the United Kingdom until and unless a majority there sought Irish political unity. Not all parties were equally vocal in that recognition, but under the surface it was there, and eventually all parties became agreed on it. By degrees, first with Ted Heath in 1973, and eventually with Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, British governments began to respond to constructive Irish approaches. These approaches sought to modify an often counterproductive British security policy or measures in the north, and instead to direct British attention to the need to substitute for that a concerted effort to restore northern nationalist confidence in Britain's commitment to the protection of their minority rights. When the 1985 agreement, which I negotiated and signed, led to a leakage of Sinn Féin support back to the constitutional SDLP, the penny finally dropped with the Sinn Féin IRA leadership, leading to the initiation from 1986 onwards of the peace process, as Gerry Adams himself has said. By the 1980s, the two governments were becoming closely engaged with each other in an increasingly successful negotiation between each other, but also with the Northern Ireland parties, including Sinn Féin. The intimacy of the intergovernmental relationship has peaked under Blair and Ahern. That's wrong about the size out of place there, because, of course, they weren't engaged with all the parties in Northern Ireland at that time. That came later, I should mean the 1990s. The intimacy of that intergovernmental relationship has peaked under Blair and Ahern. Three factors, I believe, assisted this process, which are not, I think, always fully recognized. First, the disappearance in the British political scene of leaders with memories and hang-ups about Irish neutrality during World War II. Because this never emerges in documents, it's more difficult to pin down, but from my own personal experience, I think this was a negative factor right up to including Margaret Thatcher's time. Now, during World War II, Britain's military leaders and MI5 had seen merit in Ireland's decision not to participate in the war, which could have provoked a recurrence of the 1922-23 Civil War, with German involvement this time, which would have complicated the British military situation substantially. The military and the security services, or MI5 anyway, were happy with the secret close cooperation of Ireland with Britain. However, British politicians, unfamiliar with the secret arrangements, resented Irish neutrality, and until the advent to power in Britain of John Major and Tony Blair, neither of them with any memories of the war, that misperception, I think, affected British political attitudes towards Ireland. I mention that because it's not generally realized, and it's something which I feel very strongly from my own experience is a factor that is not, should be taken into account. Secondly, from 1973 onwards, another positive factor was the good personal relationships developed between Irish and British politicians, meeting sometimes as often as fortnightly at European ministerial councils. Up to then, there were very few contacts. I worked out that between 1948 and 65, there were 5 Irish governments and 5 British governments, and that apart from peripheral contacts at the UN, WHO, or FAO in Rome, the two ministers never met each other. They had no occasion to ever meet and get to know each other, understand each other. And that all changed with EC. The third point, during the 1990s, the rapid catching up of the Irish economy with that of Britain had a profound psychological effect, eventually on both sides of the Irish Sea. Ivana Bacik refers to, I quote, a tremendous shift in the power dynamic, as a result of which in the last 20 years Ireland has moved from a post-colonial to cultural partner status as far as Britain is concerned. No longer the underdog, we are contented, she says, to view ourselves top dog, culturally and morally. I think she's a bit ironic here. Basking smugly in the Eurozone and in the envy of our EU neighbours, and having the best of Berlin and Boston. John A. Murphy echoes this. saying that by the early 2000s, the Republic of Britain were on a more equal footing than ever before, partly because of Ireland's enhanced international standing, notably through the UN and the European Union, but also because of the so-called Celtic Tiger. And he says this equality benefited the mutual relationship at a psychological level. It did. The effect was to eliminate, first of all, the Irish inferiority complex, which had been a real problem in negotiating between Ireland and Britain right through the period, not in the 20s, but after that, and the British superiority complex, which was also a bit of a problem, and which also has diminished substantially. So the psychological relationship, partly for economic reasons, has changed profoundly. But Professor Murphy adds, it was the Northern Ireland conflict that eventually and unexpectedly resolved the stalemate. Both sovereign states realized that they had an overriding common interest in defeating IRA terrorism and in trying to achieve accommodation between the divided, recalcitrant, and politically immature communities. And the deeply contentious issue became the common enterprise of the 1990s. I think that's a good analysis by him. There are several remarkable paradoxes about the whole IRA campaign. First, it has had one seminal positive outcome, one thing quite the opposite of what those concerned must have expected and hoped for, hoped to produce, is the belated normalization of the Irish-British relationship, which is the subject of this book. Secondly, having set out to destroy Northern Ireland, they now find themselves engaged in seeking to join with loyalists and unionists in governing it jointly, which is, total reversal of what was envisaged. But there's a third and negative one, of which little is said, I find, but I think is of fundamental importance. The damage done by that campaign of violence to the economy of Northern Ireland. By inhibiting foreign investment there for 35 years, they've created a new and long-term obstacle to Irish unification, even if the political obstacles were to disappear. Not very likely in the immediate future, I admit. When I first studied the economies of North and South, exactly 50 years ago, published an article in Studies, winter 1956, the North was much better off than the Republic, with a one-fifth higher level of output per head. Today, thanks to the IRA's efforts, its per capita output is one-sixth lower than that of the Irish state. It is now totally dependent on Britain for its living standards, which would drop by something like one-fifth if it left the UK to join the Irish state. Now, our state is 1/15 the size of Britain. It is inconceivable that we could take on that burden, which would involve an enormous increase in taxation that would destroy our economy. And of course, in Northern Ireland, it's not often realized that in polls consistently, 25% of Catholics said they want to stay in the UK. The reason it's as low as 25% is because it's not a real issue, and they're not faced with the fact their living standards will collapse if they left. And that's the work of the IRA. I don't know whether, if all this violence had never happened, we might be any nearer or not to eliminating the political obstacles to Irish unification. We might be, but I can't be sure of that. But certainly, the economic situation is now transformed. And that is so there are the three achievements of the IRA. Huge achievements in Irish-British relationships, ending up making Northern Ireland work instead of destroying it, and finally creating a huge new obstacle to Irish unification. It's hard to think of any revolutionary body in history that has such comprehensively failed in all its objectives. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Garrett. The format now for the rest of the evening is each of our three remaining speakers are just going to talk for a couple of minutes, at which point I will throw the floor open for some questions. So we can move on to Liz O'Donnell, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, just to, I suppose, summarise my contribution to the book, I was asked to look back 8 years after the Good Friday Agreement reflect on how we might have done things better, given the very long and difficult implementation phase which we have experienced since 1998. And I look back at some of the framework for the negotiations and wonder whether some aspects of our negotiations could have been different, which might have avoided the long period of implementation. I think central to our difficulty was that the peace process, as it has become known, culminating in the Good Friday Agreement, was really two separate processes. One was a political process, which was about a final political settlement as between Britain and Ireland on the vexed issue of Northern Ireland, which involved constitutional change, which involved negotiation with the parties in Northern Ireland about a new way forward based on a final political settlement, a new landscape, judicial, institutional, policing, prisoner release, all of those matters. And at the same time, we had to deal with a government-sponsored conflict resolution process, which was very, very difficult. And the two governments, through working together, had to supervise and become custodians for this process, and were virtually by proxy negotiating for the British government on the one side for the unionist community, and the Irish government on the other side for the broad nationalist community. And central to that was a very mature relationship and cordial relationship between the two sovereign governments. And I think that's what kept us going through the very difficult times, and they were very difficult. Those of us in the Republic from the constitutional parties had great difficulty in the beginning about the bona fides of Sinn Féin, the Republican movement and the IRA, about their true commitment to peaceful means. And we had to suspend our critical faculties at various points in the process for the greater good, hoping that a benign dynamic would eventually, after confidence building and the release of prisoners, that this benign dynamic would pull everybody over the line. And of course, the unionist community, quite understandably, had deep insecurities about the bona fides of the Republican movement. And that distrust continues and sees us right to the present day, when we still have a situation, unfortunately, that a central plank of the Good Friday Agreement, 8 years on, we still do not have those very important institutions, the Assembly and the power-sharing executive, which was central to the agreement. They have only operated fitfully since the agreement was signed. So that fundamental distrust as between the key players in this political settlement is ongoing as we speak. And I hope we can explore that later. But my piece deals with all of those issues, deals with looking forward from here, and hopefully, as is the theme of this overall book, is to look at the wider issue of British-Irish relationships now that the vexed quarrel is more or less finished as between the United Kingdom and Ireland in relation to Northern Ireland. The future, the constitutional future of Northern Ireland is in the hands of the people of Northern Ireland themselves. So now that that is the case, we can, as two sovereign governments and peoples, move on and develop in a more relaxed way our relationships on the cultural side and on the economic side. And I look forward to that, and I think perhaps as we go forward that Irish people can start enjoying aspects of our Britishness, if you like, which we have, I suppose, been shy to articulate up to now because of the nationalism that has informed our relationship with the United Kingdom. We can start looking with pride about our pre-independence history, our war dead, honouring our war dead from pre-independence, and all of the cultural and ties of kith and kin which can only be benign and pleasurable. So I think I congratulate the British Council for this initiative, because it is not before time that we can have this discussion, and have a very happy and cordial relationship going into the future, that we have finally reached a closure of history on that particular vexed issue of Northern Ireland. There is still some way to go, of course, but one hopes that a monumental folly won't be made again by the parties in Northern Ireland in failing to grasp the opportunity of finally moving towards the power-sharing executive and the Assembly, because that is the arena where true reconciliation can be played out by the parties in Northern Ireland running their own affairs. And I think everybody in Ireland is hoping that the parties will not miss that opportunity to actually grasp that opportunity and bring Northern Ireland into the prosperous economic future which is there waiting for Northern Ireland. There is an economic dividend from peace, and there is an economic dividend for the whole totality of the island if there is a final settlement and a devolved government in Northern Ireland. So, talk later.
Thank you, Liz. Moving on. Paul Murphy.
Well, first of all, it's good to be with you. Many faces I recognise from previous meetings and occasions here in this lovely university, and to congratulate the British Council for the tremendous work they've put into the second of these volumes on Lives Entwined. As I came across on the Virgin Atlantic plane yesterday from London, sipping a glass of Cabernet Sauvignon, it put me in mind of what must have happened in 1865 in a small house in Ballincollig near the city of Cork, where my great-grandfather and his brothers decided what they would do in terms of emigration. Two of them came to this country, one to this city, the other to the city of New York. They certainly weren't drinking a glass of wine in 1865 coming across to Boston. The other one was my great-grandfather, who decided instead to go to Wales. And he went to a Welsh-speaking village. They were Irish-speaking, and the priests were Italian Franciscans. So they had a bit of interest in Sunday Mass there in South Wales. And so those issues which are discussed here in this book, in a sense, reflect the little anecdote I've just told you, in that it's about, firstly, the identity of people, how they see themselves and how they have seen themselves for 150-odd years. And secondly, of course, how three countries are intertwined in that little story: Ireland, United Kingdom, and the United States of America. And it's no coincidence, is it, that the best allies of the United States are Britain and Ireland. But at the same time, for many, many decades, Britain and Ireland were not good friends in the international scene. And that has changed overwhelmingly in the last 10 years. Change, as I have seen in the years that I've spent in Northern Ireland, very much for the better. Partly because Ireland and the United Kingdom are now both members of the same European Union club. And so what Garrett was talking about earlier on, where ministers from those two countries for years never spoke to each other because they never had the opportunity, now they're members of that particular club. Secondly, of course, that the difference in terms of relationships of the two governments have changed beyond all recognition, something that Garrett started, and that grew and grew and grew into what it is today. Not just the relationship between two prime ministers, but between the ministers at every level. And when Liz and I partly chaired the talks in Belfast, it was evident that the world had changed in those sort of situations where we talk together in a very different way. Not so very long ago, I went with Tony Blair, when I was Secretary of State, to Dublin on his 50th birthday. He went because a row had erupted between the two governments, not a huge row, but a row which in early days would have erupted into something which was significant. But he went to Dublin, to Farmley, and we had a meeting to overcome the difficulties, which we did. At the end of that meeting, because it was his 50th birthday, the entire Irish cabinet came into our meeting room with a great big bottle of champagne to celebrate the 50th birthday of the British Prime Minister. Now, you just think if that could have happened 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. Impossible for that to have occurred. A small story, though, that signifies the change in relationship between the British and the Irish government. And the British and the Irish parliaments have changed. This tie I'm wearing, by the way, is the tie of the British-Irish parliamentary body, which I co-chair with Pat Carey, who's a TD. And the relationships between members of our parliaments have developed tremendously over the last number of years. And so our politicians, our TDs and our MPs, our senators and members of the House of Lords getting together. And we met last in Killarney some months ago, where for the first time in the history of that body, the Unionist Party, in this case it was Paisley's party, Dr. Paisley's party, the DUP, turned up to address the joint meeting of British and Irish parliamentarians, something again that wouldn't have occurred. And finally, there is a huge change in how Britain itself governs itself in the last few years. I never refer to the Anglo anything because I'm not English. The British-Irish Council has been established. England is not Britain. And very often people made the mistake of thinking that the British were the English and the English were the British. Now, I've got nothing against the English. My mother comes from, indeed, was born in England, comes from an English family. But the world has changed in the United Kingdom too, in that there is a parliament in Scotland, an assembly in Wales, and of course, waiting to be resurrected, the assembly in Belfast. And so those changes are all about identity too, so that you can be comfortable as an individual, as a politician, as I am comfortable. I am proud to be a British person, and I am proud to be a Welshman, and I am proud to have Irish origins. And you can do all those things and be comfortable with yourself because of the developments that have occurred over the last number of years. In the next few weeks, the peace process in Northern Ireland will be at a critical stage. Liz very rightly said that the institutions of Northern Ireland, the Assembly and the Executive, are critical to the working of the Good Friday Agreement. If that doesn't work, and if the institutions have to go, then the Good Friday Agreement has gone, basically. It strikes at the heart of it. And so all our thoughts and prayers must be with the political parties and with the governments to ensure that those institutions do get up and running again, because only when people work together will real peace and stability come to Northern Ireland. And to the two governments who will be overseeing these talks, I merely point to them to something I heard this morning in Our Lady of the Victories at Mass. It is today is the feast day of St. Matthew. Even tax collectors can become saints. And St. Matthew's gospel inspired the pastor of that church in downtown Boston to remind us of the importance of the virtue of patience. And that impatience is a sin, and that patience is a virtue. And only with patience, I think, can we ensure that success comes, because what we've seen over the last number of years, a small number of years in many ways, has transformed Ireland into what it is. And we still have an awful lot of work to do in Northern Ireland to ensure that the sectarianism that still exists there is overcome, and that they work together for the benefit of all the people who live in that small part of our world.
Okay, finally we're going to move on to Kevin Cullen, and then we'll take some questions.
Thanks, Mike. Some years ago when I was based in Dublin for the Globe, I was asked to appear on a show in the BBC in Belfast, and I remember the host asked me what I thought of Irish and British newspaper coverage of America, and I said, well, I'm actually deeply offended by it because it portrays all Americans as obese, Bible-thumping gun nuts, and we all know that only half Americans are like that. But I kind of used my chance at my submission in this book to address some of those stereotypes. And it always struck me in all the years I covered Ireland, and particularly in the North, is that American intervention was perceived as either all bad or all good. Republicans couldn't get enough of it, and Unionists wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot barge pole, as they would say. And I didn't recognize the stereotypes and the images that were thrown at me by all sides up there. The stereotype of the Irish Americans sitting around singing rebel songs in South Boston pubs, passing hats around for the boyos, I just did not recognize that. I'm not saying it didn't happen in the 70s, particularly after Bloody Sunday. I'm not saying it didn't happen in the immediacy of the hunger strikes, but it was a wildly exaggerated perception. And it always struck me that whenever, like Tom Foley, when he was the Speaker of the House, or people would go over to Ireland, they would say, they are urging Americans not to give money to the IRA. And I'm saying, I don't know anybody who gives money to the IRA. There are IRA support groups out there, but they make up a very small percentage of Irish America. And that's kind of what I wanted to write about. The monolithic Irish America I always heard reported back to me, I didn't recognize. It's not what I saw in Boston. It's not what I saw in Woodside and Queens. It's not what I saw in Chicago, North or South Side. I didn't recognize the Irish America that Irish people and British people talked to me about. So I tried to address that in the book. I remember distinctly in 1994, after the Loyalists followed the IRA's lead and called a ceasefire, they were members from the two factions, ultimately the Ulster Defense Association and the Ulster Volunteer Force, and their various political manifestations came over to BC. And they got up there, and three from each side, and they sat there and they took questions. And after it ended, Joe English, who had been a UDA commander, came down, and I said, "Joe, what about you?" He looked at me, and I said, "It's Kevin Cullen from the bar." He goes, "Kevin, I'm sorry, I didn't recognize you." I said, "That's okay, Joe. This is the first time you and I have talked, and you didn't have a balaclava on." Joe said to me, he was struck by the reception he had got here in Boston, and he said to me, "I thought you all were provosts." There were all sorts of preconceptions. And as an American, as an Irish American from Boston, and with a name like mine, I found that whenever I would meet Republicans, they just assumed I was going to write it their way, that I was on their side, and they were thrilled that everybody in Boston was, on the side of the Ra. And I just, I would say it's not like that back home. It's a little more complicated. So all those various strains are sort of what I tried to address in this piece about. And in addition, telling some self-deprecating stories, which are too hard to do because I made a fool of myself and continue to as a reporter in Northern Ireland as I still learn about what's going on over there. But I also wanted to put on, and it has been put on record, but maybe in a different context, that if the perception during the early parts of the conflict is that American involvement was all to the negative, I think American involvement, particularly over the last 10, 12 years, has been extraordinarily positive, and that it operated without obvious self-interest. It's funny because when the peace process really took off, everybody was looking for, motivations. And I remember hearing Dr. Paisley refer to George Mitchell as coming from the Kennedy stable of Boston Irish America, and I don't ride horses, so I didn't know what he was talking about. But this is the same guy that in 1993, I believe it was, he called on me at a press conference in Belfast and said, "I recognize our Republican friend from Boston." And I got up and I said, "Just point of order, Dr. Paisley, I'm a registered Democrat." So there were lots of preconceptions and expectations of people over there based on where they're from and what their name sounds like and all that. And I took the opportunity to suggest that it isn't all like that. And echoing what Dr. Fitzgerald mentioned about the American or the economic renaissance of Ireland in the Republic of Ireland in the 1990s, most of that was underwritten financially from inward investment from American companies. Yep. So whatever we think, and I think that history books will record mostly about the political influence of Irish America, not even Irish America, just American business went in there before the politicians did. They saw an educated, articulate workforce that was underutilized. They saw an extraordinarily high quality of life, although I wouldn't want to buy a house in Dublin these days. They were there before the Celtic Tiger was known as the Celtic Tiger, and they underwrote a lot of the confidence that transformed and manifested itself in the political arena, so that the Irish and British were dealing on an equal basis. But also, I had friends when I lived in London that their respect for Ireland grew from a business point of view. You know, they enjoyed dealing. I had friends who lived in London who loved flying over there doing business, because not only did the business get done, but they said the crack was 90 after that. It was better than going down to Canary Wharf and sealing a deal. So with that, I'll just turn it over and let's have some questions.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think you'll agree that comments have ranged across history, across the Irish Sea, across the Atlantic, contemporary issues in politics, and most centrally identity, at which point I ask any questions. At the back there.
I've been amazed or astonished at how much the role of personal relationships plays in all this. And I remember an op-ed piece by Padraig O'Malley here in Boston, who said one of the problems with the northern-southern north-south conflict is they just don't like each other. And there's been this palpable breakthrough between Irish and English. Is there something coming up, or is it moving forward in terms of the north-south relationship as well? And if not, why not?
Not to the same degree, anyway. There are north-south tensions. They're not confined to nationalist unionists. There are really quite deep divisions in the attitudes of northern nationalists and southern nationalists. And on each side, there are problems in regard to the other. And I don't think we have addressed that. In fact, I worry that division amongst nationalists is we're not paying enough attention to. What has been happening certainly has been that we've learned to solve this problem, you have to deal with both sides. When I became Minister of Foreign Affairs, I found that there was a ban on contacts, members of the Department of Foreign Affairs, with unionists. And I said immediately, well, that's no way to work. You get nowhere like that. And I pointed somebody to contact and be in touch with the unionist side. I was sometimes attacked for doing that. But over the years, what is very interesting is the extent to which many unionists, certainly in politics, but I may say publicly, have come to respect and appreciate the attitude of Irish politicians and of successive governments, and to begin to understand the genuineness of our concern to achieve peace and stability in Northern Ireland. They saw us originally as wanting to take over the place, and the Anglo-Irish Agreement was seen as an effort towards that end, which was complete nonsense. But that's changed. And I think there are quite a lot of unionist politicians who, with all due respect, feel more comfortable with the Irish government at times than the British government. And the reason for that, of course, is because they have felt let down by the British government. The British government was supposed to support them against these ties, and it didn't seem to do so. So it's understandable that there would be more problems between unionists and the British, but that has been accompanied by a changing and more positive relationship in the Irish government and politicians and the unionists. So that on that side, yes, things have improved. Where they seem to me to be not so good is between the two lots of nationalists, and that worries me.
Please.
Yeah, I think one of the most noticeable disadvantages in political terms since the Good Friday Agreement and in trying to implement it has been the marginalisation of moderate moderate opinion, the middle ground. And those at the extremes who hold the most extreme views on both sides of the community, i.e. the DUP and Sinn Féin, have actually done electorally very well since the Good Friday Agreement. Ironically, the parties that took the risks, that were progressive, that were moderate in their viewpoints, that led their constituencies into this new spirit of compromise and moved from their fixed positions, those parties have done badly. The Ulster Unionist Party has been decimated. They only have one MP left. David Trimble, who took all of those risks under huge pressure, and Sinn Féin were so long in bringing about the long-promised decommissioning that he was politically destroyed in the long wait. And you see the voices of rejectionism and extremism from the DUP. They've done well electorally, and they are now the kingmakers. Similarly, the SDLP, who were always in advance, pressing out the agenda, accepting the changes with policing, whereas Sinn Féin always held back, and Sinn Féin always held back on the decommissioning. So unfortunately, those moderate voices have lost out, the voices of the Alliance, the Women's Coalition, sadly. And it seems that only those parties on the extremes had the political confidence in their electorates to actually deliver the ultimate compromise. I think what hasn't, we'll go back to that gentleman's question about how come the parties in Northern Ireland still seem to don't like each other. I think that goes back to that original absence of trust. The peace process was very micromanaged by the two governments, and perhaps it was too top-down and not enough coming up from the parties themselves. The two governments really organised, they did all the sort of drafting of documents, they cajoled the parties into discussions, there was a certain amount of proxy negotiations. So at the end of the day, the individual politicians didn't really get to know each other in a human sense, so that trust wasn't built up before they had to make this historic settlement across a whole range of areas. So that's why it has taken those 8 years for all of those issues to be sort of psychologically internalized by these people who have come such a long way and have had to bring their constituencies with them. So that issue of distrust is still there, but I believe the DUP, they have no political reason now to, nobody's at their back in the way poor David Trimble had such political pressure by the DUP all the time when he was trying to move forward. The DUP are in a very secure political situation. There's nobody at their backs criticising them. So they could make that historic move now and share power with Sinn Féin, but they have to be happy about the bona fides and confident about Sinn Féin's willingness to embrace the new policing arrangements and become part of the institution of policing in Northern Ireland, which is a huge move for Sinn Féin. Those are issues which go to the heart of it. As George Mitchell said, it was never about the decommissioning of weapons. It was about the decommissioning of the mindset. And for the Unionists and the DUP, they have to believe themselves as human beings that the mindset has been decommissioned and that these people who represent the nationalist community in Northern Ireland in their diversity are truly committed to sharing power on the basis of politics only and absolutely going away from criminality, racketeering and all of the sideshow connected with paramilitary activity.
Right. Tom, you then.
we live in a very different world from the time when the Constitution of the Irish Republic was established. And one thing that the Good Friday Agreement changed, of course, was that it became much more settled in the sense that the Irish Constitution was changed by referendum in order to accommodate the agreement. And secondly, that the principle of consent was underpinning the whole of the agreement, that Northern Ireland would go its way according to the wishes of its people. And I think also, and this is absolutely crucial to it, the common membership of the European Union is now meant that in some ways the ideas that were floating about before the agreement and that were fundamental before that are not so important these days within that context, in that a lot of our laws in the United Kingdom and Ireland now are made not in Dublin or in London, but in Brussels. And so we are under the same European flag in that sense. And also I think that people are conscious too that because of that stability which has come as a result of the agreement, that relations east-west, as we've described them, they've never been better, but relations north-south too are better than they've ever been. Economic relations, social, academic, medical, whatever it might be. The problem still lies, as Liz just pointed out, within Northern Ireland itself, and where the political battlefield really isn't between unionism and nationalism, but within those particular areas. So it's Sinn Féin battling it out with the SDLP, and the DUP battling it out with the UUP. That's where the battles are, which are fine in a democracy as long as the battles take the form of the ballot box rather than the bullet. And that's happened.
Yeah, I think it's very important to stress that the Irish government and the Irish people by referendum consented to this, that we removed our territorial claim on Northern Ireland on the basis of the principle of consent, and that the constitutional status of Northern Ireland remains as is. It is within the Union until such time as the people of Northern Ireland by a majority vote otherwise. And I think that was a fairly good deal for unionism, ultimately.
Yeah.
And I think, unfortunately, it was never really sold effectively to the unionist population as a good deal. I think the unionist population always felt, because there were so many other compromises on the release of prisoners and a changing of their policing system, and the unionist population felt that they were negotiating downwards and they were losing. And unfortunately, there wasn't sufficient leadership there, secure leadership there, confident leadership, to sell the Good Friday Agreement as a good compromise and a good political settlement of our differences. And I think the notion of the island economy is one which is very much central to the agreement, and that through the institutions envisaged under the agreement, there was going to be, the border was to be still remain, but to be perforated by these north-south bodies, which would allow a natural economic and cultural cooperation to go on the island of Ireland, north-south and east-west. And unfortunately, because those institutions have only operated fitfully, there hasn't been the same amount, to the extent that we envisaged, of north-south activity, of a political kind or of an economic kind. There are north-south bodies which have been operating on a sort of transitional basis. Intertrade Ireland, the All-Ireland Tourism Body, the Waterways, but we don't really have what we had in mind, which was an accountable, devolved government in Northern Ireland, which could make it all work properly.
That's the key, absolute key to it, because there's no question, were there to be a United Ireland week next Tuesday, there'd have to be a special arrangement for Northern Ireland, as there is a special arrangement for it being within the United Kingdom. And that special arrangement has to take into account the identity division we've just been talking about. There's 1 million units, they're not going to go away, and there's 750,000 nationalists, and they're not going to go away either. And so that has to be accounted for in any constitutional political settlement there might be. Any idea of, for example, joint sovereignty or government of Northern Ireland would never work. It can only work by people in Northern Ireland sorting it out for themselves. And that's why Liz and I are absolutely at one in saying that they have to resolve it themselves, ultimately, in Northern Ireland.
We've just touched on democracy, and I'm actually going to be very undemocratic and bring the proceeding to a temporary close. in the sense of the formal session now finished, and we're going to go downstairs for a drink, at which point you are free to argue, discuss, question any of the speakers as you wish, on a one-to-one basis, or hold forth and tell them all what you think. But for now, I think it's time to thank Liz O'Donnell, Pearl Murphy, Garrett Fitzgerald, and Kevin Cullen, and thank you all for coming.